Okay, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight. We have Jason Green. He is a certified occupational hygienist and licensed asbestos assessor. He will be speaking about understanding asbestos for restorers. Jason does have a presentation he will talk through tonight and possibly go to the questions that anyone has at the end, if that's okay with everyone. Other than that, Jason, over to you if you would like to introduce yourself and take it from there. Thanks, Jason.
Great. Thank you so much, Claire. I assume everyone can see the screen there and what we're about to discuss, understanding asbestos for restorers. So yeah, thanks, CARSI, for inviting me around for a fun-packed webinar about asbestos. And I'm a certified occupational hygienist with the Australian Institute of Occupational Hygienists, and I'm a licensed asbestos assessor. So I just wanted to firstly start with an acknowledgement of country. So I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of this land, and I pay my respects to elders, both past and present. I also want to acknowledge the Gumbaynggirr people, where I grew up on the north coast of New South Wales. All right, I might just quickly share with you a little bit of Jason Green's story, asbestos story over the several decades that I've been working in and around asbestos. So yeah, there's a few pictures here that you see on the screen here. On the left-hand side here is an Indigenous community up in Barreugal, up in the northern part of New South Wales. So I was I assisted them with a remediation project of the tailings, which were beneath their houses of the community that they were working on there. The one at the top there is a massive steel works. So I've worked at a lot of industrial sites over the decades, assisting and supervising of asbestos removal projects. These are massive boilers on a BHP site. And then also on the top right-hand corner there is essentially a massive pit in the city, and you might recognise that's Barangaroo, where the three towers are now in Sydney, where many hundreds of thousands of contaminated soil was removed from that site. And then the one down the bottom right here is a Warrawang power station. So I'm sure some of you on the call may have worked on some industrial sites, so a lot of different asbestos materials on these sorts of sites, which we're going to discuss tonight. So these are what we're just going to get through tonight. Essentially, we want to have a refresh of what asbestos is, the types, the background. We're going to have a look at risk assessment. So as you know, as restorers and people in the restoration industry need to be aware of that. We're going to have a look at the risks and the exposure potential. We're going to have a look at the legislation and standards very quickly. We're going to have a look at some examples and case studies of particular sites and things you might see in the restoration industry. And then we're going to have a real quick look at things like controls, removals, and worker protection. And then at the end, we'll have some hopefully good amount of time for some Q&A and some questions. So if you've got any questions there, please throw them in the chat, and we'll get to those at the end. So a really quick update for some people on the call that might know much about asbestos, but I'll be sort of skimming over a few things. I'll be assuming that most of you have some good idea of what asbestos is and the issues there, but we'll want to cover a good overview of everything. So there's three main types of asbestos that were mined and commercially available. You've got your chrysotile or your white asbestos on the left here. You can see my little arrow jumping around. So very commonly mined throughout the world and used in a lot of different types of products, things like guttering, downpipes, gaskets and putties and mastics and things like that. Then you've got the one in the middle, which is your brown or your amosite asbestos. Very commonly found in things like cement sheeting and friable asbestos materials, such as insulation board, fire doors, sprayed insulation, things like that. And then you've got your chrysotile, which is your blue. And so that's another amphibole asbestos fibre, and very common in your friable materials such as sprayed insulations and boilers and things like that. There is a few other types of asbestos materials which are not commercially mined, but it's still quite common in, particularly in naturally occurring asbestos locations, which is anthophyllite, tremolite, and actinolite. So let's talk about the sort of the two main types of asbestos materials. You've got your friable materials, the more dangerous materials, and then you've got your non-friable, your bonded materials. So essentially friable materials, similar to what the pipe lagging or the pipe lagging debris you can see on the top right there. So that's essentially when these materials are manufactured, the friable materials are much easily damaged. And so when they're manufactured, the matrix that they're bound up in is quite loose, and it's easily crumbled or pulverized in your hand, for example. So yeah, so I mentioned there a Class A asbestos removal license is required for that material. Then you've got non-friable or bonded materials. So these are your less dangerous asbestos materials. And so they're essentially, when they're manufactured, they're bound up into a cement matrix generally. And so they're quite hard, and it's very difficult for the fibers to be liberated out of those materials. And so, yeah, so a Class A and a Class B can be able to remove those asbestos materials. So we're going to have a good look at all of those through this. But I just wanted to step back, and I know we're talking about restoration and restoration contractors and people that are associated with these sorts of projects. So I think we've really got to step back. If we're coming onto these sites or been asked to attend one of these sites, we really need to think about it and ask a lot of questions prior to when we go onto site. And then, there's a good disaster management cycle there, which I like to show people, where it's talking about preparation, response, recovery, and mitigation. So I suppose we're in that preparation phase now of us talking about getting on site. What do we need to know? What are the issues that we need to be aware of, so that we can really risk assess and make sure that we have a reasonable idea about what we're getting to before we even get to site. Okay, seeing some nice little fire photos there and flood photos. So when we're looking at these sorts of events, or to do with if there's a restoration planned, these materials and the sites may have been heavily impacted. So it could be a flood, it could be a fire, it could be wind storms, cyclones. It could be all sorts of other sort of mishaps or accidents, or other sort of natural or man-made disasters. So we really need to be aware of what could potentially be happening on this site. So when, for example, here you can see a flood. So this is essentially the aftermath of a flood or flood and fire in this situation here. So water's inundated, there's accumulation of materials, the materials are moved around the site, and things are not where they used to be, and they may be in weird and wonderful places. And so what we find when asbestos-containing materials are heavily impacted by water, they can change form and they can be broken down, and if there was bonded materials there, they may become friable, or there may be friable materials there which are essentially distributed and strewn about the site. So we've got to be really careful and aware that these things can happen. When you're looking at fires, as I'm sure some of you on the call have seen before, there's that intense heat, combustion. There could be explosions. So these asbestos materials are made to withstand intense heat. But once the fire gets to a certain temperature, or a high temperature, then unfortunately a lot of these asbestos materials can explode, and so they could be strewn about the site many meters, many tens, maybe hundreds of meters away from the actual the area of where the buildings were initially impacted. So we're seeing that displacement of materials. We're seeing, again, bonded materials may be becoming friable. We've got smoke, we've got soot, we've got ash, we've got char, masking potentially some issues. And there's obviously other hidden hazards and other hazards which we're not going to go to at all, because we have zero time for this webinar. So when we're looking at these sites, we really need to anticipate this risk. We need to have a look at the building type. We need to have a look at the usage, the age, the site activities, and what tasks essentially are what's going to be happening on these sites, don't we? So with these, we want to know whether it's a residential or a commercial or industrial site. These have really different and different risky type materials on them. So obviously from residential, they're more lower risk sort of materials, moving up to industrial sites, which can, particularly your older ones, can definitely have friable materials on site. The type of building and that the usage of the building is important. So it's a shopping centre or a warehouse or a factory or a hospital. They've all had their own construction types and the different types of building materials that may be present within that area. The building age is very important. So yeah, we'll have a look at a slide shortly where it talks about the different age brackets of the types of materials you find. So in general, the older the building, the more likely you're going to find more asbestos materials, and if it's a quite old building, then it might have friable asbestos materials. So we really need to be aware of these sorts of things. So looking at the likelihood of asbestos-containing materials being present, so there's that 1970s and 1980s era is essentially where you're going to be definitely, prior to that, you're going to be finding friable and non-friable materials. So that's, a lot of those materials were, I suppose, phased out from around the 80s period. And then moving up into your 1990s, you're going to be finding those bonded and non-friable materials. And then up to 2003, which is a key time of when all asbestos was banned within Australia. So you're only going to be finding small pockets of asbestos materials there, friction pads, gaskets, things like that. But a big issue with asbestos is imported products, and so we're unfortunately still getting occasionally imported products which are coming through customs and getting past the checks there, and then getting into our supply chain, essentially gaskets in forerunners, ceramic tiles. There's a few different things where they should not be manufactured within it, but where they've come from is the standards there are certainly a lot more relaxed than are here. So after that 2003 time, we've got essentially unlikely friables, and then you've got these other potential asbestos materials there. So that's still a real concern. Okay, let's quickly touch on legislation and standards. So these are really important. I'm only going to touch on a few bits and pieces here, just because of time. But I mean, not necessarily yourself, but it's certainly the building owners or the people controlling these sites, or the PCBUs. They really need to identify these hazards, and they have an absolute duty to manage these risks and identify any foreseeable hazards on site. And so that may extend to yourself if you're controlling these sites or working on these sites. So Chapter 8 within New South Wales regs is a one I recommend that you go through and have a good look at. It's quite extensive. And then also the Safe Work Australia website has a really great cachet of standards and guidelines and codes of practice. So I've got 3 codes of practice, or 4 actually here, and I think those are going to get popped in the chat for you to download if you want, and then they may be available, maybe PDFs. I'm not too sure about that, but yes. So there's one around managing and controlling asbestos in the workplace. There's a model called on how to safely remove asbestos. There's another great one around membrane filter method and the whole situation around sampling and inspections and clearances and things like that. And then there's also a really great code of practice around demolition as well. So I fully recommend, if you want to get further information around these situations, if you haven't seen these already, I absolutely recommend that you go through and check those out. So as I said before, December 2003 was that hard date on when all asbestos materials were banned for importation into Australia. So that's, yeah, and that is essentially the date on when buildings are required to get a survey as well. So essentially, yeah, anything prior to that, it must have an asbestos survey. So yeah, well within your rights to ask the building owners or managers if there is an asbestos survey on site, so you can know essentially what materials are on these sites, you know, prior to you even stepping onto them. Okay, so I just wanted to have a look at some of the exposure issues and around asbestos. There's a lot of different information out there around asbestos, and you know, there's a theories out there around one fibre can kill and things like that. And yeah, it's a very emotive issue, as I'm sure everyone on the call tonight is aware of. But yeah, I just wanted to go through some of the variables around asbestos and how you can become exposed. So when you're looking at asbestos exposure, it's about the dose. So there's a certain threshold that you need to get to before the risk level increases. So there is minor exposures which are you know, essentially below that threshold, but then when you're getting into larger sort of exposures, then that risk level will increase, and that will depend on, you know, the level of your exposure over, and it's over, not over days, but it's over many years essentially. So it's, yeah, so that duration of that exposure is important as well. So yeah, so the less time that you're exposed is certainly is related to the risk of you potentially contracting an asbestos containing disease. So the dimension of the fibres. So when we're concerned about asbestos exposure, it's the airborne fibres that we're concerned about, that we may inhale while we're in the asbestos high risk zones. So yeah, if that asbestos is being disturbed, then we need to essentially breathe in those respirable fibres, and that's the dimensions essentially of what is required on what is a respirable fibre. So that's essentially less than you know, 10 microns. Really, if you're talking about dust, you know, it's really fine materials that we're really concerned about, that we're breathing in, and they're the ones that can get deep into our lungs and cause those issues. So and the other one is durability. So durability is around the biopersistence of the fibres and the length of time that they're in the actual the lungs, so that they need to be in the lungs for many years. You may have heard there's a latency period or a certain time period from when people are getting that significant exposures to when the actual asbestos-related diseases can become apparent on X-rays, for example. So it could be 20, 30, 40 years at least from that exposure time to when these asbestos-related diseases are essentially apparent. And so, as you could probably expect, dilution will be a factor in that exposure and what's in the air at the particular time. So if you're working outside, obviously it's going to be much more heavily diluted as opposed to inside, or if you're working in semi-confined areas, then that exposure potential may be much higher. Okay, let's jump on to look at some of the asbestos materials. So, I mean, as I mentioned before, friable materials, there's so many different friable materials out there. We're just going to touch on a few sort of common ones here. So you can see here in the middle here is an asbestos fire-rated door. So you can see the inside core lining and outside timber lining, and so the inside is essentially a friable core material. And so you can see it here in the actual handle here, which is exposed there. So very common to find asbestos fire-rated doors in older buildings. And then as they're refurbished over the years, those fire doors can be replaced with asbestos-free fire doors. Other materials here, we've got fibrous sheaths on power cables or in electrical cupboards or electrical backing boards, things like that. There might be friable asbestos sheaths on cables, so we need to be aware of those sort of situations. Okay, some other examples of friable material here. You can see here your old style fuses in your switching gear on your electrical backing boards there. So you can see the packing inside the fuses here is a friable material. So yeah, very common in your old houses and on commercial industrial sites as well. Obviously, there's your classic asbestos lagged pipes there. Very common in obviously commercial and industrial buildings and hospitals and things like that, which used to insulate the actual pipes on the either in the wall cavities or roof cavities or subfloors. And then this is another very important friable material here. So you can see here it's a vinyl sheeting. So the top layer is actually vinyl, so it's a plastic sort of sheet, but underneath is the nastiness. You can see here there's a friable backing here, and that is very common in your older houses and older buildings as well as floor coverings. So very concerning that material is a very high percentage of asbestos materials, and so this sheeting is generally stuck down with glue. The glue may contain asbestos, but then essentially when you try and pull this up, it makes a massive mess and high probability of getting exposed in a major way if there's that material being removed without knowing. Okay, let's have a look at residential houses. So, I mean, there's a lot of asbestos materials that can be found in your older style houses. So here's your typical 1950s fibro shack here. So you've got your sheeting, you've got your eaves, you've got a lot of different things within these older sort of buildings, within your bathrooms, kitchens. There may be sheeting behind tiles. There might be debris in the gardens. The fencing may be corrugated sheeting, for example, or formed asbestos sheets. There may be underlays or floor coverings, flues for the hot water heaters, maybe fibre cement pipe work. There may be form work in or under concrete slabs. It's garages, sheds, roofs, stormwater pipes. There's a myriad of places that you might find asbestos materials in houses. So we'll probably have a look at some of those now. So you can see here, asbestos fibre cement pipe work and guttering, things to do with roofing is very common that contain asbestos materials. Vinyl floor tiles. So you can see here that the tiles are a bonded or a non-friable material, but some people may miss what we see over here, which is the actual glue or the adhesive. Blackjack is what it's known as, and that can contain asbestos as well. So make sure that is tested if you're working in a building that may contain asbestos. So you can see down the bottom there some wet areas, so very common in your kitchens and your laundries and bathrooms and showers. So it could be asbestos sheeting on the walls, behind the ceramic tiles around the bath, for example. There, so very common to be concealed behind those wall sheetings and floor sheetings. The floor underneath here, maybe a compressed fibre cement sheet if it's an older building. On the right there, you can see an electrical backing board. So that's your older style electrical backing board, or zelemite is what they call that. So it's older school, very hard, very bonded material, able to withstand intense heat. So very often you'll see a house burnt to the ground, and there in the corner is the nice electrical backing board, hardly touched. And you see the fuses in the front of that one as well. So hidden asbestos, there's a lot of different areas within buildings where asbestos materials may not be found. If there's only a non-intrusive or a basic sort of a survey done, they may not have been able to access the hidden areas behind certain walls or in inaccessible areas. So this is some good examples of that. So we've got asbestos glue or sheeting that may be underneath certain layers on a roof, for example, or under some sheeting here as formwork. Here's your classic old fake brick look from the 1970s. So you can see that, and then there's asbestos sheeting behind that type of product there. And then depending on how many layers of floor or layers of wall sheeting there may be asbestos hidden in behind those as well. Okay, moving on. So let's just have a quick look at some emergency procedures. A really quick sort of overview of that. I'm not going to dwell on this too much, but I suppose when we're looking at emergency situations, we want to be aware of that if there is a potential issue there and there's asbestos been disturbed, then we need to make sure that that's identified. We want to cease those works in those areas. A survey needs to be done, or further assessment or inspections need to be done. Site management needs to be notified there. The area needs to be secured and isolated so that people are protected from those areas and not being inadvertently exposed. Then we can move into essentially reporting of the materials on site, getting a register or a report on what the materials are, and then move into essentially a removal phase there. So that's a really basic emergency procedure that may be needed, or if you're working on sites that you want to make sure that has been acted to ensure that people are protected on the site, or for people coming into certain areas on the site is adhered to. Okay. Let's jump into some project examples and some asbestos issues here, which are quite common in the restoration industry, and as we've mentioned, around fire, flood, natural disasters and things like that. It's very common to find nasty situations like this. So when there's a fire that rips through buildings, these are sort of some residential and commercial and industrial examples here from fires and large accidents have happened. So as I said before, when this fire rips through these buildings, then the asbestos materials can explode, and then they heavily degrade, and then you've got essentially bonded materials turning into friable materials. So it's a big mess, which is it's for your Class A removal contractors, of course. So stock may be contaminated within these sites. We might have debris on the ground, many hundreds of meters away potentially. I mean, the material may have been washed into areas where it shouldn't be going, such as drains and off-site. Maybe it may be going into public areas as well. So I think there's a lot of different things here and a lot of variables that could happen when you're looking at these fire situations. Okay, so this is another good example of a fire situation here. You can see on the right-hand side here, an older style building here, obviously, and so there's a lot of different asbestos materials we can see just in this photo. So we've got window eaves here, and there's they're excellent eaves. They're all on the ground now, aren't they? So window putty, we might have materials that were outside, now they're inside the building. Debris and things all over the ground, and then it may be within in the grass or the vegetation or trees adjacent to the buildings as well. So we've really got to be aware of these situations before of what we're sort of potentially getting ourselves into. Okay. So other things, like storms, like winds, like accidents, things like that. We've really got to expect the unexpected. So, I mean, when we're looking at these types of situations, we need to really step back and make sure that, if we're going into these areas, looking at them, if you're a first or a second responder to a site, for example, then, you really need to make sure that it's looked at and essentially expect the unexpected. These materials will not be in the same place that they were when they were installed in the buildings. Okay, so moving on from there, let's have a good look at controls and things like that around asbestos materials and working on sites that may have asbestos materials. Obviously, that elimination phase and substitution phase is not what we're really sort of covering today. So, I mean, but we want to have a look at some of these engineering controls, administrative controls, and personal protective equipment that's needed for these sites and when we're accessing them. So particularly if we're working in a restoration situation. Okay, so just quickly for as a minimum, really, for if you're working on non-friable sites, and there's a highly likelihood of that it's on site, then you really need to protect yourself from the get-go if it's not fully identified exactly where things are. So we want to make sure that you're wearing your normal PPE, but you want to make sure that you're wearing a respiratory protection which is in line with the risks that you're finding on the site, or the potential risks that you're finding on site. So minimum would be a P2 respirator with particulate filters, and then class 5 or 6 overalls to protect yourself from that dust and debris if you're going onto the site, gloves, safety shoes, things like that, booties to protect your shoes or your gum boots, whatever it is. So you want to make sure that if you're going into these areas, that you're able to, that you're not contaminating your clothes, you're not contaminating yourself, and that you're able to decontaminate yourself safely and adequately once you're exiting these areas. Okay, so what is a successful asbestos removal project? So let's have a look at some of those things here, because I mean, whether you are have a class A or class B asbestos removal license, then you should be well across all of these things, really. But I suppose I want to talk about this more because if you don't necessarily have a class A or B asbestos license, then you need to be aware of what a good removal looks like and what's entails in that. So if you're going in there before or during or after these situations, that you're sort of aware of what needs to be done. So we really need that comprehensive audit. We need a demo audit or survey of the buildings, so that we know exactly where the materials are, what condition they're in, and the extents. Okay, so we want to make sure that those gaps are really sort of covered off, so that we're aware of what's in there. And so if there is unknowns and things like that, then really strict caution needs to be taken when people are accessing areas that haven't been accessed previously within areas where you're removing ceilings or walls and things like that. It might be a mold situation and you're going in there removing ceilings or whatever. So if you don't know what's behind that, then you really need to take precautions, proactively to ensure that you're protected. So using a trusted licensed asbestos removal contractor. So obviously you want to use the proper licensed removal contractor. If it's basic bonded materials, then your bonded class B license is more than adequate. Your class A licensed removal contractors are much more geared up and prepared and trained and experienced to do these sorts of, particularly the larger and medium sort of size asbestos removal jobs. So they're the ones that have all of the trained staff or the trained supervisors to really do this work safely and quickly, which is sometimes what our clients need. We want to make sure that you're using a trusted occupational hygienist. So you want to make sure that they're part of the situation, part of the conversation, so that they're aware of what's going on, that they're either in there before, during, or after, and so then they're part of the journey of this asbestos remediation, so that then they know and you know that what the expectations are, so that when you get to the point at the end, you want to make sure that the job is done safely and done well, but then it's done to an occupational hygienist standard. So that's where your licensed asbestos assessors come into the fore. But you essentially want to make sure that you're set up for success there, so that things are being removed properly, and then you can get it signed off relatively quickly. So we want to make sure that communication is fluid, that everyone is aware of what's going on, that people throughout the process are communicating well with each other, so we don't want any surprises for the next contractors or the next people coming onto the site. We want to make sure that, knowing what things can't be removed at the start of the project, and what other contingencies we need to put into place. We want to plan for high readings if we're getting airborne fibres coming from the removal zone. So I mean, if we're getting airborne fibres in a non-friable situation, that's a real red flag that there may be some controls that are not working well, or they're not in place at all. So we want to make sure that there's contingencies for that. We want to do same day air monitoring reports. So when there's doing air monitoring, you want to make sure that you're getting those results that night, so that you're knowing when what's going on the site. So that's one of those contingencies that you want into place. So you want to make sure that things are allowed for, and extra time is allowed for these sorts of jobs, because they cannot be rushed. And obviously the right tool for the right job, you want to make sure that they're properly tooled up and have more than enough personal protective equipment and the proper equipment to do the job safely. And then we want to obviously avoid exposure of the workers, but anyone around the situation as well. Okay, so let's I'm not really going to go into too much more detail around the asbestos removal project or the way that that's happened, just for in the conscious. I know I'm just conscious of time, but I think I really want to sort of focus a bit more about respiratory protection now. So it's very important that needs to be covered off when you're going into these situations and working in and around areas which may contain asbestos, or that it has been identified that it contains asbestos. So when you're looking at respiratory protection, you've got sort of two main sort of categories. You might have air purifying respirators, which have filters on the outside, so that provides a negative pressure essentially there, so that you're protected when you're breathing in, whether it's a half-face respirator, which is essentially a minimum situation for an asbestos situation, or if it's a much higher risk situation or a removal situation, then your full face mask may be more appropriate. And then the other type is obviously a supplied air respirator or SCBA, self-contained breathing apparatus. So, I mean, that's obviously a much higher level of control, which is not necessarily needed in an asbestos removal situation. But there's sort of the two main categories there. And so when we're looking at respiratory protection and making sure that the workers and whoever's wearing the masks, so there's a lot of different factors around that mask seal, and making sure that people are wearing the correct and appropriate mask for the situation and for that person. So facial hair is a massive one. So if people have facial hair, then they're not going to get that proper seal around the face. So I mean, if they do have facial hair, then either a full face mask or a loose fitting full face respirator or head top may be more appropriate. Things like a powered air respirator might be more appropriate if people have facial hair, but essentially we want to try and avoid facial hair if people are working in these situations. So we want to make sure they're properly protecting themselves, because essentially with that stubble, and you can see on the side here, these tiny respirable particles can essentially bypass our stubble and facial hair, and when we're essentially breathing in any of the contaminants or asbestos materials that we're in that work area. So we want to make sure that people are really aware of that situation, that any facial hair is really, they're not going to get a proper seal and they're exposing themselves. Okay, we want to make sure that people are trained and aware of how to use that type of respiratory protection. We want to make sure that any other PPE that they're wearing works well with that respiratory protection. So if they're wearing hard hats or glasses or hearing protection, we want to make sure that these things don't interfere with that seal or with that mask that they're wearing. There's other issues to do with facial features. People might have different sort of sized or different sized faces, which may prevent them getting a good seal on that mask. We want to make sure that these things are taken into account. Okay, so looking at the type of mask or respirator that they're getting fitted for is really important. Okay, so all right, let's move on to respiratory fit testing and training. So I mentioned that around training for respirators and wearing of respirators. So the Australian Standard 1715 is a really great standard for that. So I really recommend that you look into that standard, and it has some really good information in there around respirators and the use of the respirators, and also around fit testing. Okay, so we want to make sure that if people are wearing a mask, that they're fit tested, either qualitative or a quantitative fit test. So you can see here, there's pictures here. So qualitative is using essentially a hood, and they spray non-toxic type sprays into the hood while the person's wearing a mask, and so that tests or challenges the seal around the mask. But yeah, there's a few limitations around that methodology where people can not have a bad sense of smell, or they may think that they smell something or not smell something. So there is quite a few limitations on that qualitative method. So we really prefer the quantitative method. So things using there's a picture here of a porta count. So there's other different quantitative methods out there. So it's essentially a machine that tests or challenges the seal around people's face. And so you do various exercises to confirm or mimic what you're doing on site, to confirm that you are getting that good seal, and that that particular mask that you're issued is right for your face size and shape, and that you are getting protected. So yeah, the Australian Institute of Occupational Hygienists has got an amazing program called ResFit, and that essentially is an accreditation program for fit testers. So if you're looking for respirator fit testing, I recommend you look at that website for people that are doing fit testing out there. Okay, so yeah, again, around training, so we want to make sure that people are trained on how to use the PPE and the respiratory protection that they're using for these sites. So they need the donning and doffing and user seal checks is really important. How they're storing and taking care of their mask is very important. It needs to be properly decontaminated and taken care of, and if there's any issues with them, then they need to be replaced, or if there's parts broken, then they need to be changed out as well. And obviously the filters as well. So we're using particulate filters for asbestos removal or asbestos contaminated areas. So you need to be wary about changing out of those filters, either the pre-filters or the particulate filters on the masks. And so that, yeah, you need to have a good change out or exchange program happening for that. So if these filters are getting, if you're in high dust areas or contaminated areas often, then you're going to be changing those filters out quite often. So if you're only going into these areas occasionally, then those filters will potentially last quite a long time. Okay, well, we're basically sort of near the end of the presentation there. So thanks for listening to that, and I'm open to some discussion and Q&A now. So yeah, thank you for listening. So Claire, have we got any questions out there in the chat land?
Hi, Jason. We actually don't have any questions so far.
Right.
But it must mean that you are that good that no one actually needs to clarify anything.
Right. I see. Fair enough. Okay.
You must have covered off everything exceptionally. Nobody needs to ask any questions.
Maybe. I mean, if there's anyone on the call that wants to come off mute and have a chat, or they've got any other questions that I didn't cover in the session, I'm happy to have a crack at answering those. Otherwise, yeah, we can certainly, if you've got any other questions or concerns, then please reach out to people like myself. I mean, trained and experienced occupational hygienists are they're the ones that are competent in doing these sorts of assessments and giving you the right advice. And I think, yeah, we really need to be looking to subject matter experts and people that are working in the field and have the right licenses and checks and accreditations and certifications, so that people are not getting the wrong advice and they're not getting led down, into a situation which can essentially potentially contaminate themselves or their workers, or God forbid the general public or people in these workspaces. So yeah, so I think from a restoration perspective, I think there is a lot of really good guidance out there for restorers. The Restoration Industry Association, for example, is a really great knowledge source there. Obviously, the Australian Institute of Occupational Hygienists have some really great sources of information. Safe Work New South Wales, for example, all of our different state regulators around Australia have really good information on their websites. Safe Work Australia has some really good information that people can glean but I mean, if there's any sort of unknowns or you're not sure about a situation, then you've really got to lean on those other contractors and people that really know what they're doing and that are out there doing it all day, every day. So,
definitely. Go to the professionals. Definitely go to the professionals.
Yes, that's right.
Don't leave it to chance.
No, that's right. Yes, I can see you put those links in the chat there, Claire. So that's great. Perfect. So people want to get those, then they can you can download those. So
I'll email them out to everyone also who was signed up and hasn't had a chance to join in.
Okay.
So they can get them as well. The recording will be available either tomorrow or over the weekend. But yes, I would take it as a very complimentary point if no one's got any questions, because you obviously did do everything exceptionally. Nobody needs to ask anything.
Well, I mean, there is that. I'm sure there's things which I haven't really covered. I mean, in such a short amount of time, I really just wanted to sort of skim over a lot of and cover off the key points that particularly for restorers when they're working in these things. But I mean, obviously, I haven't covered all situations, all things that may happen on a particular site. So again, just further reasons for reaching out and getting more knowledge and expert advice from people out there that are doing this all of the time. So
definitely. Well, if anyone does have any questions following this, are they okay to reach you directly, or is there any other way?
Well, they can go back through yourself, and then I can get in contact with them through there. So that's fine. Or if people want to track me down on LinkedIn or places like that, then happy to chat about things. And it's obviously part of my job as a certified occupational hygienist and asbestos assessor. So myself and other of my colleagues do this sort of work and risk assessment all day, every day. So happy for people to contact me. So
okay, no problem. Yes, so if anyone who may be watching this back as a recording, if you do want to check anything with Jason, please feel free to come through myself also, as well as getting in touch with him over at Jason's LinkedIn. But yes, very, very thank you. That was brilliant, especially for me, very informative. So if there's no other questions from anyone, I guess we'll wrap it up there. Appreciate everyone turning up tonight, and thank you, Jason, again. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Claire, and thank you, CARSI, for inviting me on to do this. I think it's a really important topic that people need to be really aware of. I'm sure there'll be people that will be watching this back at another time. They're a bit too busy. So I think if there's more information that hasn't been covered by me or in the resources that we've referred to, then please reach out and get more help.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much again, Jason. Have a lovely evening, everyone.
You too. Thanks for listening.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night. Bye.